Everybody. I was living in an area in inner Sydney up until June of this year. And when I first moved into that area, it was a place where I could go on a short walk from my house to all kinds of funky boutiques, to a big shopping center, to all kinds of really neat places. Within 2 years of moving in, so by 2014, I was starting to notice huge numbers of vacancies in the commercial real estate space. The rents had gone sky high, and there's something here in Australia called negative gearing, where if you're a property owner and you don't have tenants, you can offset those tax losses against other holdings that you might have in real estate. I don't know if you have that in various states or across the United States, but it's one of the reasons that we had a lot of empty space even before the start of COVID. Once COVID hit, wow, things went absolutely crazy out here. And the number of vacant spaces was just unbelievable. So here we are, and we're now in the middle of what I would call a Coronacoaster. And my gosh, we have had so many ups and downs globally and in individual countries. From a futurist perspective, it is normally much easier to predict the near term than going farther out into the future. And as I look at what the possible futures might be pre-corona, I would be looking as a technologist as to what kinds of products are pre-commercial, what kind of investments are being made, what's happening in research labs, and looking at different scenarios and then making my predictions based on a combination of real hardcore science and scenario planning. But what's happened with COVID is that we've had all of these crazy things happen that are impacting our day-to-day lives, which means that in the near term, things are changing. And of course, that has a major impact on the long-term view of what will happen from a technology perspective, from a society perspective, and on a whole of humanity perspective. I do not expect that we're going to be out of this in the short term. I seriously hope that I'm wrong, but this new Omicron variant that is overtaking the world is really having a major impact. And in particular, in the property market, I was looking at some stats in the US on the property market. And in terms of vacancies, like number of people coming into an office on a daily basis, it was just over a quarter what it was in the pre-pandemic days. And not only that, but there are a large number of people who are becoming accustomed to working from home after nearly 2 years, and actually see this as something that they want to do on a longer term basis. Technology companies in particular are embracing this, but not all jobs are necessarily jobs that you can do from home. But we're going to see dramatic impacts in the real estate market, especially the commercial real estate market, both during the coronavirus crisis and in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis. So remote working is definitely here to stay. There are a lot of things that companies need to do to enable their staff to adequately work from home. And that's great for office workers. If you can work from a computer, you probably can work from almost anywhere. But what if you're a technician and you have to do things to a server farm? You may or may not be able to do that remotely. But how are you going to do a job like plumbing remotely? Or if you're an electrician or somebody has, lawn mowing that needs to be done, that might be hard to do remotely. But I will be talking to you about some technologies that are on the horizon in the very, very near term and actually available today that will enable people to do non-office type of work from remote locations. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that are commercially available today that you may not know about and can incorporate a lot of these into the construction side of your business. One of the interesting things is science as a service. And this actually isn't a new concept. I first started hearing about companies offering scientific experiments as a service all the way back in 2016, mainly using APIs, that's application programming interfaces, to be able to control experiments and even instruments at a remote location. Some of the key technologies that are required for this kind of service is the ability to use things like telepresence, feel like you're in a remote location, and haptics, which is the sense of feeling and touching, along with virtual reality, and to a lesser extent, augmented reality. There are so many interesting companies that are starting to make science as a service available on a platform basis. And even institutions like Harvard are starting to make their equipment available on a service basis. But what I want you to do is think and extrapolate remotely, into your business. One of the things that I was seeing at the very, very beginning of the coronavirus crisis was a whole slew of robots being manufactured by companies from all over the world that used ultraviolet light to disinfect areas. And a lot of these were remotely controlled. This is just an example out of Thailand called Germ Saver, but it's just one of many that I was looking at. And as a futurist, I thought, wow, this is actually a really good use of robotics. We can disinfect areas really, really well because ultraviolet light kills all kinds of microbes and germs. But for whatever reason, and I don't know what that reason is, we've not seen a wide deployment of that. So that's one prediction that I thought we would see that definitely did not happen. What did happen in December of last year was something that is very concerning to companies that use cloud services. It happened to be an outage that impacted Amazon Web Services, but it could have been any cloud provider. It just happened to be that this was the first one that had a major ripple effect on a lot of different companies, including Amazon's own operations. It affected companies like Disney in their entertainment parks, Netflix, even Roomba vacuum cleaners were not able to function properly, at least the newer models, because they were expecting to connect to the cloud. So what I want you to think about with this slide is what kind of cloud applications are you using? And do you have a mitigation strategy that you can use in case the cloud that you rely on goes down? Do you have a backup system? Or does it even make sense for your organization to have a backup system? But it's bound to happen again sooner or later. This one, it wasn't a hack. It was actually an automated process that had flaws in the design of the process that caused the problem. But if you can imagine this whole crazy world of cybersecurity, it could just as easily have been a hacking attempt, major cyber incident or something else. So this is something really important to think about, especially as we have so many staff working from home. As a futurist, if I had to pick just one technology that is going to have the biggest influence on the world of the future, during COVID and after COVID, it would be artificial intelligence, along with big data and quantum computing. So when I talk about AI, I'm using it as a big umbrella term. It encompasses technologies like deep learning and machine learning, but it also includes natural language voice recognition and text recognition and speech translation and the enablement of chatbots and digital assistants. It includes technologies like image recognition and facial recognition and gesture recognition. It includes all kinds of robotics, whether they be robots designed for specific tasks or driverless cars. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably getting close to 100 or more different aspects of artificial intelligence that are starting to become mainstream, although still in their infancy. But one thing that's really important to remember is that big data plays a huge role in this, because with techniques like machine learning and deep learning, what we're doing is we're training the AIs based on these huge data sets. And the more data that's in there, the more likely we are to have inadvertent bias in the data sets that a human being or even a team of humans couldn't possibly read, even in their entire lifetimes. Add into this mix of rapidly accelerating work in the AI field, advancements in quantum computing, and you can start to see that AI might go right up a curve like this. So you may not be aware, but late last year, 2021, I think it was Stanford, they designed a quantum computer that had 256 qubits. And I may be wrong about Stanford. It may have been Harvard. Sorry, I have been looking at a lot of material, so please excuse me, academia, if I've named the wrong one. But the importance of this is with 256 qubits, you can start to really accelerate the kind of computing platforms that AI and other computer devices sit on top of. With 256 qubits, you can emulate more states than there are atoms in this solar system. Think about the number of atoms in this solar system, and you start to get an idea of the magnitude that quantum computing can have on the acceleration of AI. On the flip side, technologies like blockchain that rely on very strong cryptographics that are extraordinarily hard to break with today's technology could be broken in seconds with a really fast quantum computer. So we need to start thinking about what are the implications of all of this. So I talked about AI and ethics, and I'll speak a bit more about ethics later on. But one of the techniques that AI researchers use in the world of AI to make sure that the AI behaves in the way that they want it to after they feed it these huge data sets is a technique called reinforcement learning, where they literally put hooks into the AI so that if it starts going off on a tangent and doing things that are unexpected or not aligned to a particular company's mission statement or values, computer scientists who are especially trained in this area have the ability to do adjustments and start to train the AI to behave in a way that we want it to behave. Now, robotics is an important part of AI, and I wanted to show you this example from a company called Sarcos Robotics. I've been tracking them since they actually sent me a press release in about 2018. They designed this robot exoskeleton that literally uses sensors to let people step in without having to glue sensors into their body, and shifts the weight off of a person onto this robotic exoskeleton, and it can handle up to 200 pounds. So if you can imagine, if you're lifting 100 pounds, it feels like you're lifting 5 pounds. 200 pounds, it feels like you're lifting 10 pounds. That's important for occupational safety, especially in the construction industry. But what they've come out with in the last couple of years is even more exciting. There's a version of this robotic exoskeleton that can be controlled remotely through virtual reality, where you don't actually have to be inside the exoskeleton. You can control it remotely. There are major impacts for the construction industry with this kind of technology. And they've designed yet another version that allows the robot to lift up to 1,000 pounds. There's not an automated version of this yet that you can control remotely, but I wouldn't bet that it would be long before that's available too. Another technique that's going to be super important when it comes to robotics is something called imitation learning. Because if you think about the way that robots work now, they're programmed to do specific tasks. But that means you need a whole fleet of roboticists. And every time you want a robot to do something different, you have to start changing the program. However, with imitation learning, the technique allows a human who's using a virtual reality suit and haptics and telepresence to control robots remotely. This picture happens to be from a company called Kindred AI. And they have a robot that does warehouse work for put walls. And literally a human can train it in the difference between picking up something like a piece of cloth and picking up something like a glass object like a vase or dinner plates. And that's going to be a really important tool as we move further and further into the age of robotics. On the flip side of AI, there's always nefarious players, and you've probably heard of this because you're a tech-savvy team, deepfakes. So deepfakes use a combination of sampling somebody's real voice, taking a video of another person and images of a real person, and making a third party look and sound like someone else. So if you can imagine having your CEO tell your finance controller in a video meeting that looks real and has all the right background, I need you to transfer $100,000 worth of funds to company X. We're doing project Y, and that happens. Or accidentally disclosing an upcoming merger and acquisition. There are a lot of ramifications to these kinds of technologies, especially if it comes to early stock market disclosure. And we haven't really thought about that as a society. Right now, our legal principles are placed on human action, but what happens when someone hacks into it and a human is honestly tricked and they do things that are not of their own accord? So this whole area of ethics, I believe, is going to make a big difference in the corporate suite in the short to medium to longer term. And we're going to have a new role, actually a team of people, but in charge will be a chief ethics officer, the other CEO. And they'll be overlooking things like how well any AI they've deployed for company purposes actually behaves. And what about things like driverless cars? So many decisions to be made. What if there's an unavoidable accident? Who decides who gets hurt? Is it the person in the vehicle or the pedestrian who has their face buried in an iPhone or a smartphone and isn't paying attention? You know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Or what if there's a data set that has bias in it and the AI acts according to the data set and it hasn't yet been caught by the human team that's overseeing it? So this is going to be a huge, huge area. Another huge change that we're going to see in the corporate environment has to do with automation. And in the human resources function, I think that HR in the very near future is going to stand for the head of human and robot orchestration. Where do you use a live person? Where do you use a physical robot? Where do you use a piece of software? And how do you get them to integrate as a team? And by the way, how do you let this team take live data from all kinds of sensors and other inputs from social media on what your competitors or customers are doing and change on a dime? It's going to be really important. Another thing that's going to be super important as AI starts to become pervasive in our lives is empathy. Right now, AI doesn't show a whole lot of empathy, but there's a lot of work being done in actually developing conversational AIs that look and behave much more like people behave. And people who will be empathy trainers, which is a new job of the future, will have backgrounds in things like political science and philosophy and psychology. Companies like IBM Watson are already starting to employ them to help train their AIs. I've started to hint at technologies like augmented and virtual reality. Well, these are not new technologies. This is an example out of Spain from Acciona Agua, and they're using both of these technologies and have been for quite a number of years. They use augmented reality glasses to enable their workers to actually interface with the SCADA systems that control water treatment plants so that they can get a view of what's actually happening inside of the pipes and do video conferencing with experts if something seems to be going wrong. And they're using virtual reality for training people on how to work with these really complex systems. Oops, I went one too far. I wanted to talk about a new product that's on the market from Lenovo. They just happened to be, I think, the first to make this commercial, where they have augmented reality glasses that unfortunately still need to be tethered to a PC or a specialized Motorola smartphone, but literally give you the ability to see multiple very large screens all within a heads-up display. We're going to see a lot more of this as time goes on. And that's also important for privacy too, because the things that you're seeing from the augmented reality glasses, no one else can peer over your shoulder. So let's say we're back in the old days and we're working on an airplane. Somebody on the seat next to you can look at what you're doing on your laptop. If you're wearing augmented reality glasses and interfacing with something in a digital world, they're not going to be able to see anything that you're doing. So this is another big trend. But one that's even bigger is smart contacts. And I don't know how many of you have heard of them, but literally, if you can imagine contact lenses that you put in your eyes that combine ICT functions like you have on your smartphone, augmented reality, and biotech, that's where it's heading in the future. There's still a lot of integration to be done, but let me show you a short video from a company called Mojo Vision of Mojo Lens, which is pre-commercial, but will give you an idea of what this will look like.
Modern technology promises to keep us more connected, but in surrounding ourselves with screens and devices, it feels as though we've lost something. Imagine if we could replace our screens with something that informs without distraction. Could we see differently, more clearly? Could it help us find that invisible edge when we need it most? Or allow us to connect in crucial moments, providing vital information in an instant? Introducing Mojo Lens, the world's first augmented reality smart contact lens. Put Mojo Lens on in the morning and throughout your day, you'll have.
So that's an example of a pre-commercial product. But on the biotech side, that's where I find it really interesting. There are all kinds of pharmaceutical companies that are investing in smart contacts. Johnson & Johnson has an antihistamine releasing smart contact. Queensland University of Technology up here where I live has an ocular bandage, which is a smart contact for people who've suffered corneal injuries. There are other companies that are developing the ability to have a smart lens where you blink and you can zoom in and zoom out and get better vision. Imagine all of these integrated into one really smart contact lens that you can use for augmented reality, all your smartphone functions, and for biotech. I think we're going to have stores in the future where you literally download any kind of app that you want. And speaking of AR and VR, when it comes to the construction industry and offices of the future, one of the brand new jobs is going to be an office of the future designer that uses these kinds of technologies, whether they be glasses or smart contacts, to design the workspaces that we'll be in once we start getting back together physically or even remotely. Now, one of the things that unfortunately has been very badly broken by COVID is the supply chain. I don't know what's happening in America right now, but I can tell you here in Australia, COVID is just going absolutely mad. Food shopping is almost impossible. The shelves are empty. Our supply chain is dramatically broken. And here in Australia in particular, and I know in America too, we've become very dependent on offshore manufacturing, and we need to start moving things back onshore. And technologies like 3D printing are going to be super important in doing this. 3D printing, by the way, is the common term for what's really called additive manufacturing. So let's see what this looks like in the construction industry. There's a company in China that probably about 6 years ago started to develop a 3D printer that uses construction refuse, the stuff you would throw away from a construction site, as the ink for a gigantic train car size printer that has been used to print homes, apartment buildings, and even this office building that they printed in China and then shipped to Dubai. It took all of 17 days to print this, and then another couple of months for them to get it all assembled and outfitted with all the things that they want. This trend is continuing. This picture is actually a screenshot from Airbnb of a company that's based in the Netherlands that built this Fibonacci sequence tiny 3D printed home using a specialized 3D printer. And it's just one of many examples of companies that are inventing these 3D printers to design buildings, whether they be for residential or commercial use. And this is a trend that I see continuing in a big way. But it gets even better, because last year, a number of universities in Europe, including ETH Zurich, published a paper about a nanoscale printer that they developed that uses copper as the input. So normally with metal printing, the smallest scale that you would get is 100 micrometers. Well, this experimental printer right now is able to do 3D printing at 25 nanometers. That is 4,000 times smaller than the current technology, and it can go smaller scale. 25 nanometers is equal to 195 copper atoms. That's tiny by any definition. And imagine what you can build once you start having the ability to control things at the atomic atom level. It's literally your imagination that is the driver for what can be built. And then you just program it into the printer. And copper is one of the first substances to be used, but it won't be the only one. Smart cities are already being deployed around the world. And we're talking about integrating all kinds of sensors and controllers into smart building to be able to give us real-time vision into what's happening in our physical world. In the COVID world, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, these technologies are being used for facial recognition and doing things like determining whether somebody is wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. And if they're not, and they're supposed to be, identifying who they are. One of the technologies that's underlying this is 5G, which is a telecommunications protocol that has very high bandwidth and very low latency, which means real time, boom, boom, boom. In the construction industry, we're also starting to see the emergence of smart buildings. This is from a construction giant in Belgium called Biotech. They've designed a new headquarters that's powered by AI and solar panels, so alternative energy. The AI determines and manages the energy consumption and energy storage, and they've also put in a lot of greenery to make this a beautiful place to work. But again, on the flip side of what is the impact of COVID, and also what is the impact of driverless cars once they start to come onto the scene, what's going to happen with all this commercial real estate that has empty space inside of it underneath waiting for cars? If you think about driverless cars, if they get to a level 5 autonomy where they don't need a human at all, why would a car sit in a parking garage and pay $100 for the privilege of sitting there empty all day? It won't. It'll go off and do ride sharing. But in the meantime, what are you going to do with all this space? And what are you going to do with all this investment in smart sensors and driver plate recognition and all the rest? Well, one of the things that a company here in Australia has done, Mirvac, is partnered with an agricultural company called Farmwall to use this space to actually develop produce, particularly organic produce, in the basement of its building. There's one in Sydney that's been a trial site, and allow workers to come down and learn a bit about organic farming and also take any excess and sell it to local stores. But in the meantime, what are we going to do with all this empty office space because of remote working? Well, there are companies that are starting to look at investing in subletting this empty real estate space and use it for things like storage as a service, or using space and fitting it out for education, for micro education learning, or being able to do storage in the parking garage of cars or even boats on a long-term basis. So this is the beginning of a new as a service industry that's using this empty space. Sustainability and alternative energies are super important. I'm sure you're already familiar with solar panels. In fact, I've got them all over my house. I specifically moved to an area and bought a house that has lots of solar panels where I can establish an organic garden. That was important to me. But there are other technologies like solar panels sitting in water that produce even more energy. There are wind farms, and you're familiar with them. But what about things like green hydrogen, where literally, instead of producing outputs like methane, you're using renewable energy sources to split out the oxygen from the hydrogen and using the hydrogen to power battery cells or even driverless cars. There are things like wave rollers that are being designed where you literally park them offshore and they capture the tidal energy of waves. And one that I like a whole lot is called blue energy. And with blue energy, what we're doing is we're harnessing the kinetic energy of what happens when a big freshwater body like a river or lake meets a saltwater body like an ocean. And we're using nanopore membranes to capture this energy and use it to do things like power a hydroelectric plant or even store it in batteries. This is a brand new technology that's still being experimented with, but very much worth investing in and continuing to experiment with, because it has the potential to, first of all, run on a 24/7 basis. Unless we somehow manage to kill all the water systems on Earth, we could always use this as a power source. And continents like the United States, Australia, and many others have lots of instances where fresh water meets salt water in a big way. And by the way, you can even do it artificially. It's an exciting technology. So going into the future, what's going to happen? Are we going to take technology into our bodies and turn into cyborgs? Well, smart contacts might be the first step. Stem cell research is happening in a big way as well, and we're already using it to produce artificial skin if someone has been burnt. And there's even a researcher in Israel, as of a couple of years ago, that designed a little miniature human heart about the size of a bunny heart that actually pumps and beats. Sooner or later, we're going to take stem cells using the adipose fat from our body, all that stuff that we used to think, ew, I don't want that on my body. That's actually going to help us to regenerate and maybe grow a transplanted organ if you need a heart transplant and not have any rejection. And by the way, it'll fit the cavity in your body exactly. Then we have nanotechnology as well. Imagine, and this is already being experimented on, is a nanobot that's in your body that's able to sense a blood tumor. And this is a specific example that is really being worked on, attached to the protein affiliated with that tumor. And once it's detected, unfurl and inject a blood clotting drug into it to literally starve it of blood and starve that cancer out of your system. Imagine if you had nanobots in your body that detected the first sign of COVID and killed it on first sight. Boom, no more COVID. Wow, wouldn't that be amazing? And then we get to genetic engineering and the future of health. There are scientists who believe that aging is controlled by a gene switch that we've yet to discover, but we've done a lot of work. And they think that within the next 20 years, we're going to discover that switch that controls aging in the human body and be able to turn it on and off. Can you imagine if you had a lifespan of somewhere between 400 and 800 years old? Can you imagine if you were having to work for 400 years? Oh, I don't know if I want to work for 400 years. Can you imagine being married to the same person for 800 years? No matter how much you love that person, in 800 years, your interests are bound to diverge. What will be the impact on this planet's population, on society as a whole, and on property investments, and on property inheritance? Wow, it's mind-boggling. And if that's not mind-boggling enough, think about the future of humanity going all the way into outer space. And guess what? It's starting to happen right now in our lifetimes. And there are two major factors driving this. The first is the invention by private industry of reusable rockets. And the second is the discovery of water on the moon and on Mars. And that bodes well for the existence of water on all of these other exoplanets that are rapidly being discovered just within our galaxy. NASA has already discovered over 4,800 exoplanets just in our galaxy. The future of humanity may be in the stars. Wouldn't that be amazing?